What is the central dramatic question?
Well, the central dramatic question is just another way to sort of phrase that idea that your story is about one person trying to achieve one thing, right? So it's another tool to kind of help you wrap your brain around your own story. So whatever your protagonist is pursuing, their story goal over the course of that story, if you phrase that as a question, that is the central dramatic question, and then that's the question that you're trying to answer over the course of the story, right? So, for Silence of the Lambs, my go-to example, it's will Clarice catch the serial killer? That's the question that we're waiting for the answer to, that the story is hopefully going to answer by the end of it. Otherwise, we'll be unsatisfied.
What happens when the central dramatic question is answered?
Then your movie's basically over. So, that gives us that framework for your story. So it's the thing that we're tracking. And then once that question is answered, it feels to us like your story is resolved, right? So there might be a little bit of wrap up after that. There might be, an emotional button to put on the story, or like a subplot or something that needs to be tied up, or you might need a scene to show us sort of what's the character going to do next? Where is their life going from here? But pretty much when that question is answered, that's when the audience feels like, okay, this thing that I've been watching is now coming to an end, right? Like this is the end of it.
Well, if we look at a lot of, let's say, tentpole movies, there's probably going to be a resolution unless there's a sequel planned, and then they want to kind of keep you hanging. But some movies don't seem like they always answer. There's a vagueness to them.
Yeah, I don't think a movie has to answer every question that it brings up, but that central dramatic question, we want some feeling of resolution, right? So I do think that there are movies that leave it ambiguous, and that's the point. But I think that it has to be clear that that is the point, right? So then we feel like, okay, so this experience of exploring or trying to get the answer to this question, maybe we couldn't answer it, and that's the point of it. And so that gives you that feeling of, even if the question isn't resolved, that story is resolved, because we've gotten to a point where we're like, okay, so here's how this ends. We don't know how that story is, how that question is answered.
So always know your audience is probably much smarter than you give them credit for, but then if you end it in too much of a vague way, it may just be that the writer didn't have a clear view themselves.
Yeah, I think in most cases, even if you leave it open, if it's a sort of you don't fully answer the question, or you leave it an ambiguous ending, and that's the point of your story, it has to feel deliberate to your audience. Otherwise, they will feel like you didn't do your job, right? Like they'll sort of feel like you left them hanging unintentionally. And I think you always want your audience to feel like they're in good hands. You want them to feel like you are, you know what you're doing, and you're telling them a very specific story in a very specific way. And the things that they're feeling were orchestrated by you. You know what I mean? And so even if you don't give them that like nice, tidy, neat, wrapped up thing in the end, they need to know that that was your choice and not accidental.
What if the writer can't figure out what the central dramatic question is?
Well, I don't think that there's necessarily like one, right answer that you have to figure out exactly what that question is. Otherwise, your story doesn't work. Again, it's more of a tool to kind of help you and give you a framework for your story and understand what your audience is tracking in the story, right? So it's kind of a way to get everybody on the same page. But I think just thinking about what is my protagonist trying to achieve by the end of this, answering that question of who wants what in this story, and then turning that into a question is kind of the way you get your central dramatic question. So it's knowing what you want your audience to track. That's the question that you're trying to pose by the end of Act 1, if that makes sense.
Well, can we have examples of
Sure.
central dramatic questions in different films?
Sure. So I think the central dramatic question in Crazy Stupid Love, right, would be, actually, I think in that movie, it's something along the lines of like, what kind of guy will Cal decide to be, right? It's because he's kind of at a crossroads in his life where he's been asked for a divorce. He doesn't know I think that he even says like he doesn't know who he is as a father and as a husband, and that's part of being misguided by the Ryan Gosling character. Is Cal's at a loss. He's sort of adrift and he doesn't know which direction to go now that his life as he knows it is sort of ending. And so I think if I'm remembering it right, the central dramatic question in that movie is like, what kind of guy will Cal, or what kind of man will Cal choose to be? And so we see him kind of navigate that question over the course of the movie, right? Like he sort of gets taken one direction by Ryan Gosling, and then around the middle of the movie, he realizes, oh, this isn't who I want to be, or this isn't doing me any favors. It's not getting me the thing that I ultimately want, which is my wife. So again, I'm not 100% sure that I'm remembering that movie correctly, but I think that you could look at it that way, that that's the question we're sort of waiting for him to answer by the end of it.
Sure, and can he still be a good guy despite bad things happening to him? And show that at the core he's actually a great person.
Yeah, and it's part of his character arc too, right? Of choosing, ultimately the lesson I think that he learns in that movie is the thing that he says when he stands up in front of his son's middle school graduation, where he's like, when you find the one, you don't give up. You keep fighting for them, right? So that's the kind of guy that he's decided he's going to be by the end of the movie. Is he's not going to be this womanizer who goes out and sleeps with every woman he can. He knows who he's in love with. He knows what he wants is to have that relationship. And so he's just going to keep trying. So even if you don't know the outcome, you keep trying for the one that you really love, right? So that's kind of the lesson that he learns at the end of it.
And then for Silence of the Lambs?
Yeah, so that one's a lot more straightforward. You have a nice, clear external goal in that one. So the central dramatic question there is, will Clarice catch the serial killer, right? Because that's everything that's set up, and the context that we're given in Act 1 is like, you have Clarice, you have a serial killer on the loose. She's the only one, or she's one person who has sort of a special in to get help to catch that serial killer. So that's the goal that's formed by the end of Act 1 is like, I'm going to try to catch that serial killer. So if we just turn that into a question, it's, will she catch that serial killer? And that is what the audience is watching and waiting for the answer to.
And then to go back to the Forrest Gump example, I know we're using it a lot, but that one, it seems like that's a little unclear to me.
Yeah, and again, I haven't seen that movie in so long that I'm not 100% sure on how everything plays out in it, but it does feel to me like that is a much more episodic story. I wonder if I rewatched it, and again, there are moments that I remember out of it, but I don't remember the whole story. I wonder if the Jenny relationship is actually kind of the spine of that story. And so it could be, again, I'd be guessing, but it could be that the central dramatic question has something to do with whether he'll have a relationship with her. But again, I'm not 100% sure on that one.
Why do you put the central dramatic question in between Act 1 and Act 2?
Oh, well, if we look at sort of the basic structure of a movie, we typically talk about it in 3-act structure. And that's really just how the pursuit of the goal breaks down. So in Act 1, because really the story of your movie is the story of the goal and the pursuit of this goal, right? Like that's what creates the through line in your story. So Act 1, that goal is created. Act 2, the goal is pursued, and then Act 3, it's resolved or not, right? So they get the goal or they don't. So that the central dramatic question is basically, by the end of Act 1, we have all of the context that we need in order to understand what the protagonist is trying to do. And what they're trying to do is answering that question. So that's why the central dramatic question is sort of solidified or asked for the audience at the end of Act 1, and then the meat of the movie is watching them try to answer it across Act 2 and Act 3.